Good afternoon. I'm here with Sister Teresa Clancy in Mary Filton Nursing Home in Chapel, is it? I'm sure you can see a beautiful view, or a slight glimpse of the view out the window, with a beautiful River Liffey in the background and gorgeous trees and lovely. We're in a kind of one side of a lovely little valley with the River Liffey below. So Teresa, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. It's great to finally meet you. Myself and Teresa have met many times over Zoom, but this is our first time meeting face to face. And we're here to talk a little bit about your life as a sister of St. Louis, and also, I guess, because the interview is focusing on the closure of Monaghan, be talking a little bit about your time in boarding school in Monaghan and a little bit about your life in the novitiate. So I suppose we'll go right back to the beginning, the early days. Why did you end up going to boarding school? What was it in Ireland at your time that I suppose you ended up going to boarding school?
There was no other choice. If you wished to have secondary school education, you can remember I went to Monaghan in 1946. That wasn't very long after the end of World War II. It was a poor country, Ireland, and secondary education wouldn't have been a priority. If you were lucky enough to live in a town or a city where you had the Christian Brothers, or you had the sisters, or perhaps the diocesan school, then you could get secondary education as a day pupil. In my day, that was not an option. I went to secondary school in Monaghan, St. Louis Monaghan, and the St. Louis sisters had a very good reputation for results, and it was also an all Irish-speaking school. The interesting thing about it would have been that we had pupils from Cork, Kerry, Donegal, very few local would have been day pupils, because at that time the priority was perhaps for young people to emigrate, England or America. There was very little opportunity in Ireland at that time.
Okay, so how far did you travel from? Where did you come from?
Well, I lived in a small village called Ballyconnell in County Cavan. Today, I think you could travel from Monaghan to Ballyconnell within an hour. In my day, travelling from Ballyconnell to Monaghan took the full day. We left home on the bus in the morning and we went as far as the next village, Belturbet. There we got a train, my first experience of ever being on a train. And we got the train from Belturbet to Clonus. We changed trains in Clonus and we joined the train coming from Dublin. And that was a great experience. We met all these people coming from the various places down south. We arrived in Monaghan, at Monaghan station, I think probably about 5 o'clock in the evening. To us, coming from the wee village, Monaghan was a kind of an upmarket town, and there was an ice cream shop in it called Malacca's. And with the very little pocket money we got, probably half a crown, half a crown, we went to Malacca's to have an ice cream before we went into Monaghan to spend from September until Christmas. Probably the 8th of September, we arrived as boarders and we got home for our first visit home around the 17th or 18th of December.
Wow.
A very changed world to today.
Wow. It must have been very different coming from a small village. You probably were in a very small country school.
Yes.
And then arriving in a boarding school. What was your first impressions?
Well, I think my first impressions was the size of the place. I can remember as a child going home at Christmas and saying to my mother, Mammy, our stairs has got very narrow. I was holding my elbows in nearly going up the stairs. Everything was so different, so big, but we were so happy there. We had a big trunk, and our trunk had to be unpacked. And then we had all these nuns, and we hadn't seen, I mean, I had an aunt a nun, which was away in India, so we never really saw the human face of a nun, really.
Okay.
And we often wondered, did they sleep as well as live in the big long habits?
Yeah.
And of course they had beads, long beads, and the advantage of the beads wasn't for the rosary for us. The advantage of the beads was you could hear them jangling. You knew there was a nun coming.
Okay.
You knew you had to be looking your best.
Okay. And is there any particular nun that stands out for you that time, or do you remember the nuns that taught you or that looked after you in the boarding school?
I suppose when you look back, I remember one nun that taught me in my last 2 years there. She taught English, and she was a marvellous person. She was. It wasn't an exam. You didn't feel you were doing an examination.
Mm-hmm.
I remember her. I also remembered a young sister when the second year when we came back. I was there for 6 years. I was only 11 when I went, and we had postulants with wee curly caps on them, and we had white veils, and there were 2 years of white veils. Then when we came back, I noticed a sister that had a white veil on her the year before, and she still had it on her. And I asked this sister that had just got her black veil, and I said, why is Sister so-and-so still wearing a white veil? Now, if somebody had asked me that later on, I probably would have told them to mind their own business. But she said to me, don't you think she looks lovely in it? And I never forgot that, the kind way in which she told me that story.
Yes.
So they were my two, just off the cuff, they're the two I remember.
And I suppose little did you know, even when you were having that conversation, that one day you'd be wearing a white veil.
Oh yes. The other experience I had was in 1946, the year I went to Monaghan, our first nuns left for the missions in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a scene that you would never forget. I can remember 2 big black taxis and all these sisters. I'm sure there was about 150 between postulants, novices, community sisters, singing Go Ye Afar.
Wow.
And the two going off, and to us at that time, these sisters would never return to Ireland. And I was so taken with this marvellous sacrifice that I would say that's when I got my vocation. I couldn't wait to change the world.
Yes.
That I thought God was waiting for me, you know?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was going to do all this for God.
Yeah.
There was no mention. I learned later how
Yes.
important
Yeah.
what God did for me.
That was quite a thing to witness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was
The first sisters going on mission.
never forget it. Yes.
Wow. That's quite incredible. So I suppose that brings me on nicely to the next question is, what inspired you to be a nun, or what was your ultimate reason for, or can you remember the moment you decided I'm going to enter the novitiate?
Well, just what I've told you.
Yeah, that was the
The
moment.
experience of seeing these sisters sacrificing everything.
Yeah.
I mean, we were counting the days until we get home for Christmas. And here were these sisters going to a foreign country and they might never get back. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a huge, I think maybe 8 or 9 of that year group. We were only first years. So a lot of sisters entered probably through that marvellous experience that we had in school.
Wow. So so you entered the novitiate. Was it straight after
I
secondary school?
entered the novitiate in 1952, straight after doing my leaving cert in Monaghan.
Okay.
I was just 18. I mean, when I see my own nieces at 18 and how mature they are,
Yeah.
and what they have experienced in life, and what I was like at that stage, you know.
Yeah.
Totally different world. You couldn't compare it.
Yeah. Still though, that was a much braver decision than probably today's 18-year-olds make in many respects.
Yeah,
Because it was a lifelong commitment.
Yeah. In those days too, there was the choice really in secondary school, leaving secondary school would have been Carysford or university if your family could pay for it or if you had a scholarship, and the civil service and nursing. They would have been the choices. I mean, we tend to forget at this stage what the religious and the brothers contributed in all of those years, because education was not available from the government. There was nothing, it was actually the same with the hospitals. It was the sisters that started the hospitals. All of that depended very much on the church, and the church contributing for so many years to Catholic education.
Yeah. So just to go back then to the novitiate, so what was life like in the novitiate? Have you any?
Well, pre-Vatican II.
Yes.
First of all, some of it really wasn't such a difference to us as boarders, because in the boarding school you got up at the call, a big bell rang, and Mass was at 7:30 in the morning. So your day started there. And then after Mass in the morning, we had to go back to the dormitory. We all slept in long dormitories, tidy up, get everything ready. School started, I forget what time, probably around 9 o'clock. We had our break, dinner time, lunchtime probably was around 1, I forget. 4 o'clock in the evening, I think we had tea, and then we had recreation. We could have had, we had beautiful grounds, 2 great big parks in Monaghan. There was a tennis court, and there was tennis. There was, not that I ever learned how to play it, but that's beside the point. Tennis, there was basketball, there was camogie, and those were the 3 main external activities. And then we had study in the evening, and in bed, lights out at 9 o'clock. And of course, when I look back, there was one thing: discipline was never a problem in boarding school, because every child that was there, I think, was either paid for by their family, and there was no rich people in Ireland then, paid for by their family, or maybe they got a scholarship to school. So, you knew you had to work. And it always fascinated me afterwards how the sisters managed, because there's such a diverse group of children. Some of them came from St. Louis National Schools, where they had an excellent all-round education. I mean, I remember one friend of mine saying to one of the sisters, she said, I really didn't work in my first year because I had done it all in the national school. Whereas the group that was there, I came from a very, very poor national school. And, we were all at different stages probably. And when I look back later, when I was a teacher myself, and how we were grading children and testing children and deciding the best room for them, there was none of that. It was just 2 classes in Monaghan. It was a small school, but we thought it was very big.
Yes.
It was about 250, I think, boarders at that time. It's really hard even for me to think back to what it was like then. I mean, we were up to our own tricks, of course, and one of the main things would have been if you were to sneak out. The convent, you see, was in the town, and if you were lucky enough to have any part of the money you got, I mean, we never, at that time, pocket money didn't exist as children, you know. So when you got your pocket money going to Monaghan, I think I got a half a crown. I don't know, 2 and 6 would be, I don't know what, today, for the whole term.
Right.
Because you see, you wouldn't be spending money, you wouldn't be going anywhere.
Yeah.
And the fee, at that year, I think, the fee was £40 a year in Monaghan when I went there. So we would be, obviously, food was a big thing, and we would be sneaking out if anybody had money, if you had a few pence or somebody came to visit you, and you wouldn't have had too many visitors, because nobody had a car, very few people had a car at that time. So you might, if you were caught out getting the sweets or whatever, there was consequences to suffer, you know. But that's about the only discipline I can think about.
Right.
You know, in school we were very well behaved.
Yes.
We had to be.
I suppose it was slightly out of fear nearly, wasn't it? Of
Not fear really, as much as you know, you had to behave at home too.
Yeah, I suppose it was respect as well.
It was expected of you.
Yeah.
Young children could be seen but not heard.
Okay. And then in the novitiate, was your daily routine similar enough?
Yes. Pre-Vatican II was very, very different. Pre-Vatican II, we lived in a world, a church of rules. There were all these rules in the church. You had to go to this, you had to go to Mass, you had to be there for a certain time. In the novitiate, I could actually, I think, still remember the daily timetable, you know, because there were strict rules and you knew exactly what you should be doing at every second of the day nearly. But it was a very happy time.
Yeah.
And of course at that time, like when I was a postulant, there was about, I think, 30 young 18-year-old girls that entered. Now of course, pre-Vatican II, silence all the time. You were silent at all your meals.
Wow.
You had, everything was really strict. You knew exactly when you broke a rule, and you knew all the rules. But then, of course, we had the fantastic explosion, really, of Vatican II, when Pope John Paul, what was it? Pope, oh gosh, he was a small, John the 23rd. John the 23rd was a very small, insignificant man. He was called the caretaker Pope because he was so old that they felt, I think they felt that he wasn't capable, he wouldn't be capable of doing any damage until Pius XII, I think, was the person, or maybe it was Paul VI, I forget which. The next Pope they felt wasn't quite ready for the job. And he, John the 23rd, I remember very clearly, he said, the church is in dry dock. It needs to move out and risk. And of course, that was the beginning of Vatican II. And 60 years later, we are still trying to implement all the marvellous things that came out of Vatican II. And now, with Pope Francis, who is a breath of fresh air to the church, there's fear that his vision for the church of today, the synodial church, it might be pulled back into dry dock by the people who are strongly resisting change. So I would say those were wonderful years, post-Vatican II, and it was really, I think, religious men and women that were really the people who initiated so many changes, and so many people suffered at that time. I can think of Father Flannery, I think, yes, and that was his name, Father Tony Flannery, a man that was silenced for saying the things that Pope Francis is saying today. So there was a lot of soul searching during those years, during the next 60 years, still going on, soul searching, and people trying to implement Vatican II and to realise that the church is the people of God. It's not the hierarchy.
Yes.
It's not the clerics. So it was to me, it was a marvellous time of refreshment, of life, and so many other things were happening.
Yeah.
It was happening in education at the same time.
Were you were a teacher when Vatican II came in, am I right?
I was a teacher after first profession, I went to training, teacher training, as a home economics teacher. And after that, I was assigned to a new secondary intermediate school in the north of Ireland. The educational system in the north of Ireland was very different to the south. So I was on the foundation of a secondary intermediate school. Free education in the north of Ireland came in 1947, but it took at least another 10 years before Catholics in the north of Ireland were able to provide free education. The reason for that was that Catholics had to find 80% of the money to build their schools and furnish their schools. The Protestant schools were free that time, so it took all those years. And then after that, I suppose, when the secondary intermediate schools opened, until that, the choice that all children in the north would have had was they sat an exam at 11 years of age. It was called the 11 plus. And if that examination tested you academically, and if you got the 11 plus, you got into a grammar school. If you failed the 11 plus initially, you stayed on in the primary school until you were 14 years of age. And then when the secondary schools were built, the secondary schools were the schools for the failures. In other words, children who didn't get the 11 plus had no choice. They had to go to secondary schools, whether they liked it or not. And that was a huge, unjust system that we certainly in secondary schools fought against it and proved that it was a wrong thing to select children at 11 plus. And now, thankfully, there's a common curriculum for all schools. And of course, also other changes in education in the north would have been, I spent 9 years in a single-sex secondary school, and after the 9 years there was amalgamation. The two schools, the boys and girls, came together. So my full experience practically in education was in a co-ed school.
And do you think what would be your view in co-education versus single-sex school?
Personally,
yes,
I would think co-education is the answer, but I think the most important thing is choice. And there is now, parents can choose. You can choose to send a child to a secondary school. Grammar schools are still there. Secondary schools changed their name to high school, but the curriculum is now the same, common curriculum for secondary schools and high schools. And then we have also schools of mixed religion. We have colleges, all children together, primary schools. We would have had children coming from that. It's choice. I think choice is very important.
Yeah. And I was going to ask a question, but I think you've actually answered it. How was your experience of secondary school? How does it compare to, say, the experience of the children that you taught, and I think it's really down to that kind of improvement in choice for the kids.
You just couldn't compare it.
Yeah.
And even though I was 27 years retired, after I retired in secondary school, I lived in an housing estate that was built in the 70s to accommodate the people who were intimidated out of Belfast and other places during the Troubles in the north of Ireland. So we had all of those areas, and you know, everything's growth, life moves on, and we have to keep changing.
Yeah.
I think that's the important thing.
Yeah. I suppose one thing I haven't asked you, well, I suppose, I asked you, I suppose, how you decided to become a nun, and you had that seminal moment where you saw the sisters leaving on mission to Africa in 1946. When you decided to become a nun, how did your parents react?
Oh, my mother thought like that the family now had a saint. I mean, she was delighted that I was going to be a nun, and I think she really could see there was one member of 6 of a family, one member was going to be canonized, little did she know. But anyway, that was, at that stage, she was delighted, proud to have a daughter that was going to be a nun. She had a sister, a nun herself in India, and of course, times have changed so much. I mean, during post-Vatican II, you see, there was a huge exodus from the priesthood, from religious life, and that caused a lot of soul searching on the part of people like me who stayed on. As somebody, I remember a sister, young, much younger than me, that didn't experience life pre-Vatican II. And she said to me one day, when we were postulants or novices, the question we would be asking ourselves is, will I stay? Whereas when I was a postulant or a novice, the question was asking myself was, God, I better not do that or I'll be sent home. It was a total reversal,
Yes.
But a wonderful time to live through.
Yes, indeed, a very exciting time to live through.
Absolutely.
And I think it's nice that you had that freedom to soul search.
Absolutely.
So looking back on your 70 plus years, I can't believe I've been saying 70 plus years, it's a long time to be a nun. How would you describe your life as a nun?
How would I describe it? I would describe it, I think, as very fulfilling, very challenging, because for quite a long time, I can't remember, from about 1972, I would have been the only sister in the school that I was teaching in. And originally I would have travelled from a convent locally in Kilkeel. It was about half an hour's journey to school every day. And then when we changed and I was allowed to live in a housing estate, I lived there on my own, but I was very lucky that I had the Blessed Sacrament in the house with me. And I was there for 27 years, and they were brilliant years because the Troubles had in so many ways helped us to, enabled us really to look at the kind of life we lived, Protestants, Catholics, Ecumenism became a wonderful thing. I mean, I enjoyed in those, especially in those last 27 years, being part of an interchurch Lectio Divina group, being part of a group that in our estate we were able to have interagency meetings to ensure that the people who were responsible for the council, the police, you name it, that we would meet with them and see that we got a fair deal. And it was a very enriching life, I think.
And it just, even on that note, you're talking about the kind of interfaith and
Yes.
the ecumenism, can't pronounce that properly. It really kind of shows, I suppose, a little bit of the charisma of the Sister St. Unum.
Absolutely.
That everyone is one, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
I suppose looking back, there was a great opportunity for we're all one.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
I mean, we had some wonderful experiences. I remember once on the board, the South Down, it was a various different structure to down here, and I nearly forget the names now, it's so long.
Mm-hmm.
But this, one of the men, he was in charge of religion in the public schools and that, and he organised a trip to the Holy Land for us. And of course, he told me himself it was called a scripture trip to the Holy Land. He never expected to find any Catholics on this trip, you know. And anyhow, it was quite a few Catholics went on it. We had a great time together. But one thing that I remember, one of them, we used to share an awful lot. For example, there was an evening for the Irish people, to have an entertainment for the group. And of course, the Protestants really didn't know what to do. Their identity suddenly hit them, I think. We were teaching them the three-hand reel, or I forget, the walls of Limerick or something, and we were all going to do it. And another thing I remembered, there was one girl, and she worked in the board, and in the South Down board, and she was just new into it, and this man came in with a Roman collar on him, and she asked, "Excuse me, sir, what do you want," or something, and some senior person to her called her over and said, "You address that man as father, he's a Catholic priest." And she said, I was so taken aback. How would I be calling him father? That was a very precious name to me, my own father. That had never struck me before until that girl shared that with us, you know.
Yeah.
And I also remember it was the time that Pope John Paul II came to Ireland in 70 something.
79.
And this woman from North Antrim, part that would have been particularly non-Republican, wouldn't have been Catholic, very few Catholics. This girl really hadn't, you know, her mother would have been strong, probably a strong Paisleyite, as we'd call them at the time. And she said her mother was very angry that all this notice that this Pope was getting on the television, and who'd be looking at that, she said. And this girl said she came in home unexpectedly one evening, and there was the mother sitting watching Pope John Paul II supper. So it was a great time of coming to our senses, and realising what's important in life.
Yes, absolutely.
Is the sharing and being open with each other and caring for each other.
Indeed, indeed. I'm just going to have one last question, and this isn't a question that we talked about. I suppose the reason for this interview was really just talk a little bit about, I suppose, primarily about Monaghan, your memories of Monaghan. So I just wanted to finish by asking you, is there anything that you'd like to say or share about just the closure of Monaghan, or about your time there that we haven't covered at all, be it in your time in secondary school, in the novitiate, or anything, or have we covered it all?
Of course, the closing of Monaghan is something, it's like really your own home closing. In one way, it's that. On the other hand, the writing has been on the wall for so long for religious. It's not as if we were the only congregation closing. Like, it's happening all over it. It's a whole new growth, a new birth, and I think it's wonderful that as we close Monaghan, and that our property, so far, our property, before I left Monaghan, because I ended up in Monaghan for a few months, and we were out looking at the plans for what's going to be done with the property that we've already sold to the council. which is going to give Monaghan a whole new life for tourism, you name it, for the people themselves. They have our lovely lake. We're handing on a great heritage, I think, and we're handing on a great challenge for the future for the Monaghan people to make the best use of what was created by St. Louis.
Yes. And of course, the secondary school, the primary school, and the national school are all still there.
And doing very well.
So the sisters may have moved on, but the legacy is always there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Teresa, thank you so much. That was really, really enjoyable interview, and thank you for meeting me today. Thank you.